Okay.
We're good.
Well, welcome to COLIS Caregivers of Loved Ones with Aggressive and Self-Injurious Behaviors YouTube channel. We are a support group through the Autism Society of Indiana. Today, we're lucky to have Dr. Sally Perkins, a professional storyteller, here to help us start the process of telling our stories to heal and advocate for our families. Sally, can you tell us about your background and what led you to this point in your career?
First, let me just say what an honor it is to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Your work is salt of the earth work that's not easy and is often, I'm sure, invisible and so important. So thank you so much. And I'm glad you're curious about the connection between storytelling and the work that you're doing. So my background is academic, and I spent the first 12 years of my career as an academic in the field of rhetoric and communication. And then I ended up leaving that for a variety of reasons and stumbled into storytelling. And I stumbled into it literally by taking my children to the Children's Museum and watching a performance with a storyteller. And I thought, oh, that looks like fun. Having no idea how much work it really is and what it really means to be a storyteller, not yeah. So in fact, I got started by volunteering, telling stories at a children's hospital in Indianapolis through a program called Storytelling Arts of Indiana, which is a rare arts organization that's the only one of its kind, honestly, in the 50 United States.
Wow.
And so Storytelling Arts, among the many things that they do, they sponsor story performance work, but they also sponsor a lot of work for storytelling for all kinds of purposes. So I began by telling stories at the bedsides of kids at the Children's Hospital. And you know, feeling like it was just a drop in the bucket, but it was remarkable. Some of my experiences in seeing the power of story in working with kids who didn't feel good. So one thing kind of led to another for me. I eventually had some public performance opportunities, and then it snowballed rather quickly. And I began to do a lot of public performance of storytelling, not just for kids. In fact, most of my audiences are more often with adults. That then led to adults in those audiences asking, could you help us tell stories for our organization? A lot of nonprofits would approach me and say, we know we've got to be better at telling our story to get donor support, to get volunteer support, to do better grant writing, etc. So I then also branched out and began to do a lot of training and consulting with organizations about telling their stories effectively. And ultimately that led me to the work that I'm also doing now, which is as a data insight storyteller for the company Authentics.
Wow.
Well, do you have a power of storytelling story?
I do. I love it that you asked that. Here is here's what really caused me to recognize the power of story. So I mentioned that I would tell stories at the Children's Hospital. In fact, I started doing that when my own kids were little. They're now, you know, burgeoning adults at this point, but I was telling stories once a month at the Children's Hospital. We would go in with partners to the rooms and tell stories to kids. And I'd been doing it for a couple of years. And honestly, I began to wonder whether it was worth my time. And I wondered that for a couple reasons. One, my own kids were small and it was one more night away from home. And you know how that is. You want to be with your kids as much as possible. But secondly, you know, we would go into the rooms of these kids and either they were on so much medication, you can imagine that they were drowsy, they didn't feel up to a story, or in some instances, they felt pretty good and they had a brother or sister or cousin in the room, they were bouncing around and distracted. Or more often than not, we noticed that they were glued to the big black screen that is strategically located across from their bed. And they were very screen bound and weren't very interested in the idea of a story. Often that is a sign of illiteracy, actually, when kids don't even know what it means to be asked, do you want to hear a story? So for all of these reasons, I kind of wondered whether it was worth my time to continue to do this volunteer work. But then one night, my storytelling partner and I walked into the room of a little girl who was about 9-ish years old. And honestly, we weren't sure if she was up for a story. She was clearly uncomfortable. She was audibly moaning. She was holding her abdomen. So clearly she was in pain. But we also happened to notice that her mother wasn't like sitting by her side, comforting her daughter, rubbing her arms or shoulders or anything. Her mother was, not because she didn't care about her daughter, but her mother was flitting about in the room, shuffling papers, cleaning things up in the room. And we recognized that that wasn't because her mother didn't care. It was because this girl's pain was that family's normal.
Right.
So we decided we would give it a try, my storytelling partner and I. And we thought we should kind of test the waters first. So the little girl happened to have on her food tray, she had a little pipe cleaner flower and a pipe cleaner butterfly. And so we picked those objects up and we played with them just a little bit, just to get a sense of her reaction. She was responsive to that. So we decided we would go ahead and try a story. We decided we would try a very simple story, the story of the 3 pigs, you know, something we could get through quickly, just to see how she did with it. So we launched into this story. You probably remember how it goes. And by the time the second pig was building the house of sticks, her moaning absolutely stopped.
Yeah.
So we carried on with the story. You know how it goes. The big bad wolf came into the story. Her eyes got bigger and bigger. The corner of her mouth started to turn up just a little bit. We worked our way through the story. The big bad wolf goes up the roof, you know, and down the chimney and lands in our imaginary pot in the fireplace. We put an imaginary lid on that pot to end the story. And then we picked up those pipe cleaner objects, that flower and that butterfly, and we played with them again for a little bit. And I kid you not, 15 seconds after the story ended, her moaning started again.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, I walked out of the room that night and I knew 2 things. I knew, number one, that I needed to continue to tell stories at that children's hospital. And number 2, I knew there was something incredibly powerful that happens in the human brain when people are taken away into a story.
Wow.
That is my power of story like moment. Mm-hmm.
Wow. That gave me chills, actually.
Yeah.
In your opinion, can we heal through storytelling? And if yes, how?
That's a huge question. And yeah, in fact, I have 2 responses that come from expertise far beyond my own. And then I'll give you a 3rd example actually as well. So the first response is that, you know, I said that I wasn't ever sure if what I was doing was very impactful at the children's hospital. And not only did that moment have impact, but one time we were getting ready to go into a room and a physician and his team were also getting ready to go into the room at the same time. So naturally, we were completely deferential to the physician. And we said, you know, your work here is far more important than ours. And I will never forget that he turned and looked me in the eye and he said, it is not far more important. Your work is the important work here, which as a physician, he understood something about the emotional component that is necessary for healing. Yeah. Beyond that, then, I was at a storytelling conference several years later, And I learned at that storytelling conference about a research study that had been was being conducted at Northwestern University. They were studying patients who were in comatose states and trying to figure out what were non-invasive ways that they could stimulate the brain and get the brain going again.
Mhm.
So one of the things, for whatever reason, I'm not sure what inspired this, but one of the things that they experimented with was to have family members of the patients record family stories.
Yeah.
Then they put headsets on these patients who were in the comas and had them listen to these stories. Then they would take them off, some time would pass, they would put them on and have them listen again. And they would do this in intervals. And before they knew it, they started to see brain activity when these patients were listening to the family stories.
Yeah.
And so suddenly they recognized that there were other ways of stimulating the brain than simply having, than invasive procedures, medications, etc.
Right. Right.
The power of story. And I've subsequently learned a lot about where stories are stored in our brains, what parts of the human brain stories activate, and why that's so important.
Wow.
First, I just want to apologize if you can hear my son giggling like he's home. So, what is storytelling as healing? I know you kind of answered that, but can you get a little more?
Yeah. So, storytelling connects to the emotional centers of our brain. In fact, our memory centers and our motor cortex and our emotional cortices of our brains are all very closely related. So what that means is that stories can trigger emotions, both positive and negative, right? If there's trauma, it's because they're so closely related. And stories are filled with concrete visual sensory imagery. They've got action in them. Right? You could see that butterfly, you could see that bee, or the butterfly in the flower. You could see that little girl, right? All of that, and there was action in that story. So all of those parts of your brain were being activated when you were listening to me tell that story. And those are closely related to the memory centers of our brain. So healing, if it's emotional healing in particular, has to do with memory and what gets triggered. But of course, we also know that that physical healing is also related to emotional healing and health as well. So because stories impact those parts of the brain, that's so powerful. Here's the other thing that we know. We know that how we tell stories can impact how we recall our memories and how we want to shape our own experiences. So can I share with you something, another project I've been working on lately that demonstrates this notion of healing. So the last 2 summers, I have had the great honor of working with another program through Storytelling Arts, in which we've been working with formerly incarcerated persons who are re-entering into society. And when I say formerly incarcerated, I mean some of them maybe for 6 months, many of them for 20 or 30 years of incarceration. And our goal in working with them has been to help them be able to tell their own stories. And our goal is twofold with this. One, we ultimately want them to be able to tell these stories to public audiences to help the public understand what incarceration truly means and what reentry truly means, and to provide more support and understanding of our overly packed places our overly packed prisons. But more importantly, when they can tell their own stories, they control their life narrative. And these are people who have felt out of control much of their lives. When they can tell their own story, they gain control of their story because they're naming what has happened to them that got them into these circumstances. And the more they can tell their story over and over again, the less they are emotionally sucked into it, the more they have command over what has transpired and occurred to them. It's incredibly powerful. I have watched people work their way through trying to tell their stories, it being a jumbled mess in their minds because just so many things have happened, right? People don't land in prison for 20 something years without a whole host of life trauma ahead of it. And it's like someone once said to me, it's like you have a constant, are you looking at the night sky with just masses of stars? And if all those stars represented everything in your life, every person you've met, every experience you've had, it's jumbled, right? Our lives are just packed with people and events and things and emotions. But when we can tell a story about what has happened to us, it's as if we create a constellation out of the night sky, and suddenly it has meaning and it has value to us in the same way that a constellation would back in the day guide us, right, to get across the ocean or whatever it might be. That constellation can then be a guide, that narrative.
Oh, wow.
Does that make sense? Am I getting, am I on?
So much sense. It doesn't. Go ahead, Megan. What were you thinking?
Sorry, I just wanted to ask a question. Like, I know you're talking about people telling the story of past events. Do you think it can also help if it's a current ongoing situation?
Absolutely. It is true. Yes, for sure. Right. We're constantly narrating our lives. And the more we can narrate the more we can articulate what's happening, the more we benefit from that, to be sure. It's also true, however, that when we're in the moment, it is harder for us to see. And so sometimes the very act of telling the story is an act that helps us see and understand what has happened, perhaps to help us better understand what is currently happening. But so sometimes it's when we're in the midst of it, it's not a story yet because we're still living through it, working our way through it. But if we can pause and step outside of it and say, let me think about the story of it, because we're in this moment because of what has come before. If we can shape that in the story, we can gain a lot from it.
Yeah, we have an add-on question that I'm not going to ask right now, but that's related to that kind of stepping outside of it a little bit and looking at the story. Oh, you want? Go ahead, ask it. Sorry, Sally.
Just in an emotional state, how would you recommend choosing your word? Because you can get so caught up in it.
Yeah. What we have done, for example, with the ex-offender group that we've been working with, is to help them put some structure on their story. Most of us just talk about our lives without thinking about a structure in terms of how we tell that story. And it's amazing what value there is for people when they learn just a little bit of narrative structure, because that's what allows them to step outside of the emotion and to start to figure out what am I saying here? What has happened? So I mean, I work with a very, very simple structure that was taught to me by a master storyteller. And so, for example, as we've been working with the ex-offenders, first thing we did was we just said, all right, here's 30 minutes, talk to a partner, tell them your story. And the partner is given like instructions. They cannot interrupt unless they want to ask a follow-up question. They cannot talk about their own life story. They need to keep the attention on the storyteller's story. And then if they end early, then the listener can ask more questions. Your story would make more sense to me if I understood this, that, or the other. So we started with that, but then we kept putting more and more parameters on them to help them get their story more and more focused. And the beauty is that they develop more and more clarity about what their story means. What are the most impactful moments? What is it that they really, what do they really need in that story? And so just, at some point in that process, we gave them just a little bit of structure to help them understand that, stories typically go through 4 parts, right? Things start out with normal, once upon a time in a land far away, right? There's a king, queen, and a princess. Everything's normal. And then it's not a good story unless there's an uh-oh. Nobody's going to keep reading that fairy tale unless we quickly get to, but then one day, a frog leapt out of the pond and bit the princess on the nose. We have an uh-oh in the story. Something goes awry. And of course, there's suspense till we get to what's the turnaround. So the fairy godmother or godfather or whatever it is, right, has to come into the story and turn things around. And then there's a new normal at the end. We know the formula for the fairy tales, but for people's lives, the more they can see that, where was I? What happened? What were some of the interventions? I mean, and they're multiple. We go through these loops all the time in our lives, right?
Right.
Some intervention, and then we reach a new normal. And in fact, this master storyteller that was teaching me this loop structure said, the problem often is that when people are just cycling around in the uh-oh, that is often indicative of addiction. Whether, right, because you're cycling around, whether that's addiction to substances or whether that's addiction to, the multitude of things that we can be addicted to.
Really interesting. I'm wondering about that cycle, and this is probably a more specific question because many times when you have a loved one with aggressive and self-injurious behavior, you feel like you're in their loop. So, if you're a caregiver, but that's probably a real deep question on how to formulate specific stories based on this, this concern or this life experience. So very interesting. Okay, thank you. Megan, did you want to follow up with anything with that question?
I'll probably ask something later. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves.
Okay, yep, right. So if we want to use our story to heal and process trauma, how do we even start to craft our story? It seems pretty overwhelming, especially if you talk about a loop, of where you're at.
Yeah. I do often find that when you give people literally a vision, I should say this for me, when I work with people needing to tell their stories, and their stories are stories of trauma, they are lost in them, right? It's emotional. There are all the details. There's all the everything. And that's simple. I mean, literally, it looks like this loop that I often show people with a little arrow of intervention in it. And literally seeing that, it's like it puts it puts their story outside of themselves. And now they start to put it on that structure, and they can disentangle themselves from it a little bit because they're literally looking at something. You know, it's like, I don't know about you, but have you ever been in a conflict with somebody and you literally write things down and literally lay it on the table? And then suddenly you're dealing with the problem that's on the table. You're no longer at odds with each other anymore. You know what I mean?
Right.
You're trying to make a decision and you're now dealing with it because things are there, right? And so we're attacking. The problem is now sitting on the table. It's not you as much anymore. It's this, and so you can, right? Because you can disengage emotionally somewhat because that's where it is. So that's what one of the techniques I would say that I have found is really helpful is literally giving people a structure by which to think about story that helps them get a little bit disentangled from their own emotional state with it. Does that make any sense?
It does. It
And
does.
feel free to say, not in our context. I mean, I want to hear about that if it does not resonate with the context of the work that you're doing.
No, I've actually thought of that with my daughter. She used to, I would try to have a schedule, and she wouldn't listen to me, but if it was written down, like you can't argue with the piece of paper or the whiteboard, you know, like
Right. It's visual, it's structure, and suddenly the emotions start to come down with it.
Yeah. That's
so do we have to share our story to heal, or can we just write it down? And then I would add, what if you have stage fright?
Absolutely. No. I mean, there are no rules from on high. They're not the 10 commandments of storytelling. So of course, writing one story is therapeutic. I mean, without a doubt, it does not have to be shared. I will say there is something incredibly powerful that happens in the human brain when you tell the story. So the notion of you getting command of your situation, of your trauma, of your experience is probably greater if you can actually tell it to other people, and really telling it multiple times. As a storyteller, as a story performer, I have found kind of a remarkably interesting pattern in my experience. I wish I had research to back this up, and I'll tell you the truth is I don't know if there is scientific research or what it is to back this up, but I will tell you that in my nearly 20 years now as a story performer, this is true. If I tell a story to an audience 6 times, don't ask me why it's 6, but it's around 6 or 7. That's when the magic happens. That's when I start to own the story.
wow.
I don't know why it is. And it has to be in front of an audience. But once I hit about 6 or 7 times, I start to own the story. And what does that mean? That means the story is in my bones. I can move the story. I can change the story. I don't have to be thinking about what comes next in the story. I can be present in it. I'm less likely to be emotionally sucked up into it. I told a story, in fact, on Sunday to a small audience that included some somewhat emotional things from my own experience with my kids. And I've only told that story 3 times. And I did find myself, when I got to the emotional part, having to really swallow, because I was I didn't lose control, but I could feel it happening. And I know that if I got to round 6 or 7, I would be able to be fully present in it, but not lost in it. So anyway, I say that to say, so certainly stage fright is real, and telling these kinds of stories is incredibly vulnerable,
Mhm.
right? Writing may be the only way that one can even come to grips with the vulnerability of sharing a story.
Mhm.
So I mean, that is to be honored. It is the storyteller's decision.
Right.
It is the storyteller's decision. They,
Mhm.
you know, this is one of the things I've really learned about helping people with their stories is it's their story. And so they get to claim what gets told, what doesn't get told. They get to claim how they are or are not comfortable telling it. Excuse me. Oh, I'm about to
Bless
sneeze.
you.
Thank you.
Wow, that actually is really cool to hear as we kind of move through our group. Now, again, I don't know, my mind's churning now with different things that we can do in our group, you know, to encourage but not to pressure
Yes.
about stories. So that's great.
Can I
love-
ask something real quick? Like when you feel like, because sometimes if you tell a story, like that sixth time you can get through it, and then maybe something's going on in your life and it's more emotional that time.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong, obviously, with, you know, getting upset. Are there any tricks to kind of like reel it in if you're like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm about to start bawling here?
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Um, yeah, you know, there are two things. Most of this is just the message that one tells oneself at that point. And number one is the audience is there for you. I mean, in these kind of situations,
Yeah.
the audience is mentally wrapping their arms around you.
Mhm.
It's just true. Your story is vulnerable. It is filled with pain. And if you're telling it in a way that makes sense, the audience gets that. So that means then that what you can do at that moment is that you can pause. You can absolutely take time to pause, and what will feel to the storyteller like an hour and a half pause is a mere fraction of a second to an audience member. So, you know, we know that that the breath is the best place to go to then regain composure. So, so when one hits those moments, it's about pausing, remembering the audience is not the enemy here; they care, and some very deep breathing will help one recenter and be able to move forward.
Yeah. So we're going to kind of switch a little bit just for a moment to the power of storytelling as advocating. And I'm going to quote a wonderful, amazing storyteller, Maya Angelou. She said, "I've learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." How do you feel about this quote?
Affirmation, affirmation, affirmation.
Right.
I recently read a book that Oprah co-authored. Are you familiar with this? It's What Happened to You is the title of the book. And the premise of the book is that we all too often either ask people, or at least in our head, the question we're asking them is, what's wrong with you? Or what's wrong with me?
Mhm.
And the whole premise of this book, which she co-authors with a trauma specialist, is that the right question is, what happened to you?
Mhm.
Not what's wrong with you, but what
Right.
happened to you? So I think of that when you read that Maya Angelou quote, because what happened to you were the things that people said, Can you read the quote one more time? What's the last part of
Yeah,
it?
absolutely. But people will never forget how you made them feel.
No, exactly. And so what happened to us is how somebody made us feel,
Mhm.
right? Whether
Right.
that's the good or whether that's the trauma.
Right.
And so that's why that's so important, is because how we make one another feel is sets the trajectory for how we become very often.
Right.
What is your opinion on using storytelling to advocate for ourselves, loved ones, in our daily lives, as well as on a larger platform?
Well, I am obviously a firm believer that storytelling is essential to advocacy. In fact,
Mhm.
last fall, I taught a graduate course at Butler, and the title of the course was Storytelling for Advocacy.
Oh, wow.
So yes, I believe in storytelling for advocacy. Um, so let me put some parameters around that. However, um, I believe that there are different types of stories. There are, and this is just my phrasing of how I've come to see this over the years, but there are both micro stories, which are individual stories. So there's the story of, of your experience with your child who struggles with autism or whatever, right? The individual stories or individual moment stories. There's also then a larger story about, for example, autism as we understand it in our culture, right? Or how, or the kinds of struggles that families who have a child with autism, how those families are supported or are not supported, right? So there's, and I would call that a macro story, because that's a story that can be supported with data, that there are all kinds of data points, right? More and more, we hope now, around the issue at hand that we're advocating for. And so that data, however, is often meh or meaningless unless it's shaped in the form of a story. So you can use that same story loop that I was talking about, but take the data points and use those data points, but structure them in that story loop. And within that, you can weave in micro stories, individual people stories that really have a stronger emotional impact. The point is that people, what we know about what causes people to take action. So if we're trying to advocate, right, we know that the human brain processes that anytime we speak to people, we're activating one of two parts of their mind. Either what Granville Toogood calls the conscious mind, which is the part of us that processes information and data points and reports and schedules and all that sort of thing, right? We spend a lot of our days in our conscious mind. The primal mind is the part of the mind that processes more of our emotions, our reactions, our strong likes, dislikes, all of that. And he makes this case that people need their conscious mind and all of those data points, right, to guide good decision making. But the truth of the matter is that we know more and more from neuroscience that it is not that which moves people to take action. It is typically story, which activates the primal mind, the emotional centers of the brain that actually motivate people to take action. So let's say, for example, that you're advocating for your organization. Well, you've got other organizations that are also advocating, right, for attention, for grant money, for donorship, et cetera. And frankly, the data points might show that your organization is every bit as valuable as somebody else's organization. So what moves me, right, as an audience member of that, to give my funds to what Coda's doing as opposed to what somebody else is doing. And the truth is, what we know is that story is typically the tipping point for that, both putting the data in the form of a story as well as using what I would call micro stories. Okay, that was a very long-winded answer to your question.
It makes sense. It sounds so difficult. Like I'm trying to plug in what we know of our, the experiences and the stories into this. And it sounds, I think it's going to take time.
Yeah.
To do it, a concerted effort to do it. Yes. Where did we end up? I'm like caught up in the story.
I know. But does the story look different for advocacy than healing?
Then for advocacy versus healing, is that what you said? Yeah, for sure. For advocacy, right, we have to think about two things: our purpose and our audience. And that has to guide decisions about what stays in the story and what comes out of the story. Quite simple. So my story has to have a landing point. If the purpose is advocacy, I've got to have a landing point, right? I got to have somewhere that I want this story to get to, which is, for example, I could not have made the progress that I made without this organization. And therefore it needs more funding or whatever it is, right? It has to go somewhere that makes sense for an ask, whether that ask is for legislation or whether that ask is for donations, whatever. So that means that I don't necessarily tell all of the details, because I need to tell the relevant details that help my audience connect with my goal for them.
Right.
And when it's a story for healing, it might be that all those details matter, right? It might be that a lot of those details matter. Now, the more I tell the story, the more I find that fewer and the fewer of the details are as relevant to my healing, right? So in time, they might sort of fall away. But yeah, I would say that the structure, the tightness of the story, and the sense of purpose in telling the story has to be different for advocacy than for healing.
Right.
The other thing that I just would like to throw in there is just to harken back to something that we talked about earlier, which is to say that when using stories for advocacy, we have to all be very careful about how we do that. For example, you as representatives of the organization might know a member of the organization whose story is super powerful and would be a great story. We cannot just tell other people's stories, right? Without either their permission, and do we let them tell their, right? First of all, it's always best if it can be in their voice. That's not to say that you can't tell someone else's story. You can, but you must have their permission. And not only that, we need to make sure that they are empowered along the way, saying the way you're telling the story, I approve of, or that is consistent with me, or I'm okay with that, or you know what I mean? So people, it's their story, and these kinds of stories especially. And so empowering them in the process of using stories for advocacy is critically important.
Right. Absolutely.
Well, on that note, when you're telling a story about like trauma or something, how can you get it across without necessarily sounding like a pity party? Yeah.
When we're at the point where we're able to tell the story and we're not just cycling around, right? If we're cycling around, we might not be ready to tell it yet because we are in that phase. But if we have gotten to a point, that's why that structure is so important, because the structure suggests that we move to with what's our new normal. And if even if our new normal is not where we want to be, but
Right.
it's better than where we started,
Mhm.
then our story is designed to move the listener to the story to that new normal. And if we at least get to a new normal because of something, then we're no longer in a pity party, right? Because there was some turnaround along the way. It might be minute turnaround. The story that I told at the very beginning of our conversation, we didn't change that girl's life. And it didn't, I mean, and that was a minute moment for me. It was minute, the change, but powerful nonetheless.
Yes.
So, yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It makes complete sense. And it also makes sense. I'm so delighted that you actually said it may not be where you want to be, but
Right.
it is, it's a minute change step, and as we well know, life has fits and starts, so I mean, so yes, we don't have to be perfect to tell a story. It doesn't yes. And I think that's a stopper on a lot of stories.
Yeah.
Or, as you feel like you have to be perfect and have it all together before you tell your story.
No, I mean, isn't that the work of AA, for example? I mean, members of AA go and tell their story and say every time, I am an alcoholic. I maybe haven't had a drink for 50 years, but I am an alcoholic, right? I mean, because this story is always evolving, but they are asked quickly to tell their story because that's part of the healing process. And the more they tell, the more they gain control of their scenario. And in time, the new normal, right? Normal, intervention, new normal. In time, the new normal grows. Yeah.
Yeah.
Boy, if it's my new normal is I didn't drink today, that's where my new normal is.
Right. I do have another question about that. And so we often ask in the beginning, would anyone like to share their story? And just for us to kind of hone it, what are some questions that should we just listen? Or should we try to direct? Or do we listen, then ask questions? Like, I mean, just your input on that. What is your feelings about that?
What is your purpose at that moment? Can you tell me?
I think it varies.
Yeah. I mean, kind
Well,
of just checking in to see how everybody's
checking
doing.
in. Yeah. I mean, should we have, I guess, Megan, this is something for you and I to talk about. What is our purpose on that question? Checking in. It usually is checking in though. So maybe it's just listening. Yeah. So we need to hone in. I need to hone in on the purpose when I think of that question. So
it can also be very helpful to think about different kinds of prompts for stories. To help people kind of think about maybe ways in which they have gone from a normal to a new normal without even realizing it.
Right.
So, I'm just playing around with this, but there may be value in different kinds of prompts. Like, who tell us about someone who helped you get from point A to point B, right? And so then it's a little more focused, and a person will be kind of instrumental in whatever might have been even a minor turning point for somebody. And it would give people a point of focus or, yeah, anyway.
That's a great thought for us to think about, prompts, which I think we've done, but I think we need to reorient ourselves to that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it my turn, Megan?
I was just going to ask something. So
Yeah.
like Denise mentioned, we're trying to get people to tell their stories, and ideally we would like people to be more open about them and kind of express them, because we feel like this group is kind of not seen as much. And a lot of the stories, people are embarrassed or ashamed. I'm sure you've experienced that with working with inmates. How do you get people comfortable and kind of give them the power to do so? And then there's also like the fear of what others will say about your story.
Right,
Mhm.
right. So I will talk to that based on the most recent experiences that I've had in working with the ex-offender groups. One is it's making sure there are very clear ground rules from the get-go, which I'm sure
Okay.
you've done, right? But
Mhm.
here are the ground rules about people's stories. A, they don't leave the room,
Mhm.
and B, it's that person's story to tell and no one else's to tell. And C, I give, like, if there is going to be response to the story, I give prompts as to what those responses can be, so that the responses can't be, well, I had this happen to me, right? But
Mhm.
for example, I might say, one piece of feedback that you can give is to tell the person what in what you just heard was the most memorable moment, or what point in the story were you completely locked in and not thinking about anything else, or what part of the story confused you because you just didn't quite understand it, right? Those are legitimate questions that people can keep the focus on the storyteller for, not giving
Yeah.
judgment or feedback, but it keeps it curiosity and a sense of, wow, this is what moved me.
Mhm.
So that's one thing that can be very helpful, is to direct the way people can give responses to the story.
I like
Um,
that.
the other thing that I have found particularly helpful and comforting to people is to start by putting them in pairs and say, you're just going to work with one other person to tell your story. And so with these guidelines, right, of if you're the listener, you've got some rules you have to abide by. And
Mhm. Yeah.
and then if you work one-on-one, I mean, I've been amazed with these ex-offenders. They just immediately were able to tell it to another person.
Mhm.
And then gradually we put them in groups of 3 and said,
Mhm.
now so now you have a little bit more of a sense of an audience. And then gradually it was, can you stand up and tell it to the whole of us? We weren't a terribly large group, but right by that point, it's, can you be in front of a group and tell the story? And because it was so incremental, by the time they were telling it to the group, they had a much better sense of what the story was. And in fact, it wasn't till about, I don't know, the 3rd or 4th iteration that I gave them that story loop and said, now that you've told it several times, what do you really want to include and what can go, right?
Yeah.
Because you've
Right.
gotten used to telling it.
Mhm.
So that's been really helpful. So that's one of the strategies that I use often to help with the comfort of it, is by letting people work in pairs. But you do have
Yeah.
to monitor it and structure it so that it doesn't get so that it stays focused on storytelling.
Mhm. Yeah. Wow. Um, do you do seminars on storytelling for healing and for advocacy?
I do, yeah. I taught a whole course on it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there are, I know I do, I mean, the work that we've done with the ex-offenders, it is inherently involving healing, right, as part of the process. And we talked with them about that from the get-go. Most of the work that I do, just because this is what I'm asked to do, is more around advocacy than around healing.
Mhm.
But I do know some other professional storytellers who do a lot of work around healing. In fact, there's you might be interested in this, the National Storytelling Network is an organization of storytellers across the country. And they have a subgroup called, I don't know, healing is in their title.
Sure.
One of their subgroups is about storytelling, the Storytelling Healers Alliance or something like that.
Mhm.
So that could be a wonderful resource to you of others
Thank you.
who do storytelling, who do a lot of work with storytelling for healing.
Mhm. Thank you.
How would you use storytelling to approach decision makers in the field of mental health, intellectual and developmental disability?
Decision makers, can you just elaborate a little bit about what's in your mind about decision makers?
Just like people that would be able to make more services, kind of things like that, or how would you go about when you're not necessarily clear of what the solution is, you know?
Mhm. Yeah. Okay, so these are actors, people who have power, right? Some sort of influence, right? People of influence.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's where I would go back to what I was talking about earlier about that macro story and micro story notion.
Mhm.
People of influence typically need data points, not just individual stories, in order to make decisions. And there's
Mhm.
wisdom in that, right? We cannot change a policy or change a plan or build a program based on two great stories of individuals, right? We need data points to know that this is prevalence, that there
Mhm.
is prevalence in this. So that's where, but again, weaving that data into the shape of a story, and then using micro stories, using those individual cases that really move people to see the power and the impact, it is really essential. So it really harkens back to that again when you're working with decision makers. And if you don't know what the solution is, a story can be, here are the data points, right? Here's where we were 10 years ago. We didn't know anything about this, right?
Mhm.
Or there was very little data. And here's what we know now that, so many families are struggling with these kinds of issues. We give the data points on it. And then we say, we could share, right? 1, 2, 3, whatever, micro stories of individual families who represent this kind of struggle. And it could be, we don't know what the answer is, but we know they did not have this, they did not have that, and they did not have the other. What can we do? How can we work together to give them, so how can we get to a new normal with them? And maybe it's for us to work together to figure out what kind of intervention would be valuable in getting us to a new normal. But it's structuring it that way so that it's not just throwing the data out there, but it's here's what was normal.
Mhm.
Here's what we know now. Here are the
Mhm.
most powerful data points that we have, what we know now about
Right.
families struggling with these issues. Here are the stories. But then we got to lead our audience to what do we want them to think about, even if that is in collaboration with us to devise solutions.
Okay. Any books you would recommend? You recommended the Oprah Winfrey book, quote, written by somebody. I have it written down. Any other books you would recommend for us to look at?
Sure. Okay, I'm literally looking at my book.
Yeah.
I have to pull out my favorite titles. Let's see. The Story Factor is a nice text. that the author has done a lot of work with a lot of different types of groups. So sometimes it's storytelling for advocacy that she's talking about in there, and sometimes it's more storytelling for I don't know if she uses the word healing, but right, with groups who need it. So I would use that one, and I would also one of my favorite books is called Story Worthy. It's actually written by Matthew Dix, who was I don't know, 5-time grand champion winner of the Moth Radio Hour. The Moth is a storytelling program on the radio, and so it's kind of funny. I mean, he's a 5th grade teacher and also this grand champion winner of lots of storytelling things. He's very, very practical about his storytelling, and in fact, he has a sense of you're telling a story for an audience, right? So he's not just about telling the story for him. He's not writing for people to tell their story just in their own, just to write their story, right? Necessarily. He does have a sense of audience with his storytelling work, but nonetheless, one of the things that he writes about that I have found a practice that I have implemented in my own life is he talks about how do you find the stories in your own life? How do you stop and get out of the swirl of things to notice that's a story at this point. And part of it is a practice that he has about the writing your 5-second moment of every day. In other words, if it's almost like a mini journaling practice of saying, what's my 5-second learning moment today? What is the 5 seconds where, and it, again, not that I changed, I still eat too much ice cream or whatever, right? But what moved the needle even that much, where I gained a new perspective, I gained a new insight, I gained something. And that practice generates stories, right? It helps us to start to see stories in our lives. So anyway, that might be of some use as well.
Yeah, thank you.
It's also a good fun read.
We could use that too. That sounds great. I think we've covered all of our questions, plus some that we asked you.
Have I talked way too much?
No, you haven't.
It was just interesting. We just keep having more questions. I'm really grateful that you took the time to do this. And I feel like we have so much material to talk about and to process. I don't know how you feel, Megan, but I think it'll help give us some direction too. So can we hit you up for some free consults when we hit Indiana's legislator trying to figure out?
Absolutely.
Yeah, promise it won't be soon, but we have to get all our data and everything organized. But thank you, Sally, so much.
Thank you for taking on this project. I mean, you've taken this on just like because you're good people, haven't you?
I want to tell you that Megan's story hooked me. So she will never give herself credit, but her story hooked me. So I believe in the power of stories. So
this is the last thing I'll say. There are 2 reasons, we do know this from research, there are 2 reasons why people, if I gave you a list of organizations to donate to, there are 2 reasons why people select out of a list of organizations, right? If I said, here's a list of 10 organizations and I said, choose 2. People choose either because they have had a personal experience with whatever it is. And barring that, a story is the second reason why they would choose it.
Yeah.
So you've just proven that, Denise, with your comment.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Megan, do you want to close up?
Sure. So a big thanks to Dr. Sally Perkins. We really appreciate you coming and talking with us. Like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you guys later. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.